It's a basic human need. A roof over our heads. But in cities all over the world right now, it can't be taken for granted.
People don't have homes right now. People don't have anywhere to go right now.
For the next decade, we will still see this problem.
The world's housing market is hurting. We're living in a time of rapidly rising rent, tired out tenants, developers drowning in debt, and house prices higher than ever before. And barely a corner of the globe is untouched. In this video, we'll tour some of the housing crisis hotspots.
Every time you think it's not possible, it just continues to move higher.
I think homelessness will rise in a lot of these urban areas.
So what are we doing to take on these problems? Find out in Business Beyond. So let's start right here in Berlin. Because in recent years, tenants in the German capital have been making an awful lot of noise. They've regularly railed against rents that have risen 42% over the past 5 years. They claim greedy landlords, private equity firms and hedge funds have made the city unaffordable to many who've traditionally lived here. In early 2020, they scored a major victory. The world watched on amazed as the left-wing government in Berlin introduced a cap on rents and froze them for 5 years. For tenants, it seemed too good to be true. And it turned out it was. A little over a year later, a federal court ruled the law unconstitutional, rendering it null and void. Many tenants still feel crushed under the heel of the powerful landlords who own their apartments. We were invited into the temporary home of Heinz-Jürgen Korte. He was moved into there after the discovery of mould in his original apartment. The landlord said repairs would take a matter of weeks. 3 years later, he still can't return to his flat.
Warum muss man sich denn immer geschlagen geben? Nur weil jemand seinen Verpflichtungen nicht nachkommt, muss man nicht irgendwann dann selber sagen, von wegen, ich stecke jetzt den Kopf in den Sand und dann ist das halt so, jetzt verschwinde ich hier. Das wäre ja genau das, was sie gewollt hätten.
Stories like Heinz-Jürgen's have led Berliners to demand that power is taken out of the hands of major landlords. In a referendum in September of 2021, they voted in favour of a law that would force major property owners in the city to hand some of that property back to the city authorities. It followed a colourful campaign demanding the confiscation or expropriation of apartments from Berlin's biggest landlords.
Unser Ziel ist es, mit dem Volksentscheid bezahlbaren Wohnraum für alle Berlinerinnen und Berliner zu schaffen. Wir wollen, dass die großen Immobilienkonzerne, also die mehr als 3000 Wohnungen in Berlin besitzen, vergesellschaftet werden. Das heißt, dass sie wieder unter demokratische öffentliche Kontrolle gestellt wird, damit nicht mehr profitgetrieben die Mieten weiter steigen, wie sie das in den letzten 10 Jahren getan haben.
A whole host of political and legal hurdles need to be overcome if those expropriations are ever to actually happen. But the result of the referendum, along with policies like that short-lived rent cap, mean that large property developers might want to think twice before investing their money in the German capital. Property prices may be climbing in Berlin, but around 9,000 kilometres away, they're living in a completely different world. Berlin isn't even the most expensive place to live in Germany, but Hong Kong consistently tops lists of the world's least affordable cities.
Over the last 2 decades, housing prices has been expanded for 2 times, 3 times, for some of the estates, maybe 4 times in Hong Kong.
The SARS epidemic of 2003 and 2004 is the opening chapter of the Hong Kong property price story. Since the downturn the disease brought, the island's economy has been going from strength to strength, only interrupted by the arrival of another, more recent coronavirus. That period has also seen many people from mainland China taking advantage of a policy allowing them to move to Hong Kong.
This policy has been gradually increasing the residential population in Hong Kong, and at the same time, Hong Kong's economy is picking up, and we also have so many expat population that comes in. And so over the last 20 years, I would say that it has been like a structural shortage in terms of this kind of housing supply here.
The average cost of a residential property in Hong Kong is thought to be over 20 times the average household income in the territory. It had been thought that protests in recent years and the increasing influence of Beijing in Hong Kong might take the heat out of the market. But there's been little sign of that. Once again, property prices are heading for record highs.
The government acknowledged the issue and they're trying to look into various ways to solve it. But I'll say it would take quite some time to change the whole game, if not the next decade.
Hong Kong's housing market is also feeling the side effects of developments on the Chinese mainland. The city of Shenzhen has become a sprawling tech hub with a population of 13 million people, and property prices there are also soaring. So much so that border districts of Hong Kong are being seen as a future, more affordable commuter area for the giant metropolis. Now, while we're talking about China, we have to mention Evergrande. The debt crisis at the country's biggest property developer shocked markets around the world. It left hundreds of thousands of people unsure if they would ever live in the homes they'd forked out all their savings to buy, and has called into question the very foundations of China's property market. Chinese and Hong Kong investors seeking to invest elsewhere are often turning to our next stop, the Canadian city of Vancouver. Property prices are moving further and further out of reach for the people who live there.
If you're a nurse or a school teacher here, or even some lawyers and doctors and stuff, that housing is very expensive. And in some professions, completely unaffordable.
In September of 2020, the average home in metropolitan Vancouver would already have cost you over $1 million Canadian dollars, around $850,000 US dollars. But in the 12 months after that, that price went up by 130,000 Canadian dollars. That's a 13% rise in 1 year. But Vancouver is no stranger to such rises. Why?
The huge driver is ultimately, really cheap, low borrowing costs. I mean, today in Vancouver, right, you can go and borrow a variable rate mortgage for 1.5%. We've got inflation running at 4%. So, a real negative interest rate of 2.5%. We have a lot more investors funneling into the housing market just on that basis.
Property prices have become one of the big political issues in Canada. In elections in September, parties across the political spectrum ran on promises to tackle soaring house prices. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was re-elected partly on a pledge to ban foreigner home purchases for 2 years. But Vancouver already has a hefty 20% tax for buyers from overseas.
A lot of the foreign owners are they're offshore individuals that already have a Canadian citizenship, or they have permanent residency here, or they have family that has, citizenship here. And so they're not really captured by the tax across the province of BC. Foreign buyers made up just over 1% of all transactions, which is a tiny, tiny amount.
The rise of house prices in Vancouver in recent years raises a question. When will it stop? Surely it can't go on forever.
It doesn't feel sustainable. But it just continues to move higher. When prices have gone up for 30 years and you can borrow at 2%, you're going to continue to get this overwhelming demand that developers just aren't able to keep up with. And it's a tough one. I just don't know how it all plays out.
While Canadians grapple with whether or not they've got a property bubble on their hands, their neighbours are worrying about an altogether different imminent threat. Across the border in the United States, hundreds of thousands of Americans are facing the prospect of losing their homes, particularly tenants in places like New York, as state and government moratoriums on evictions introduced during the pandemic come to an end. After all, Americans working in the sectors where people were suddenly losing their jobs, like retail and hospitality, were far more likely to be renting than owning their homes. Millions of Americans have the prospect of eviction hanging over them. In each of these states, over 18% of renters failed to pay their rent on time in August 2021. In many more states, that was still the case for 10 to 18% of tenants. Only a few remaining states had a lower rent delinquency rate.
Rent growth is the strongest I've ever seen it in history, so that makes it very, very difficult for people, that are kind of living on the edge. So if they're paying, $650 a month, for rent, and that's going up 10, 15, 20%. Their incomes certainly aren't going up 10, 15, 20%.
So how, in a wealthy, developed nation like the United States, are so many people on the verge of being thrown out onto the street, especially when the federal and state governments have made available more than enough money to bail every single one of them out?
The U.S. federal government has appropriated almost $50 billion to help renters with back rent, utility payments, late fees, that kind of thing. And by my calculation, there are probably about $20 billion, $25 billion in current arrearages. So there's plenty of money. It's just getting that money into the right hands.
One of the barriers to getting the money quickly is the need to prove that you lost your job because of the pandemic. Mark Zandi is confident the majority of people will manage to get the money they need in time, but others are still likely to fall through the cracks.
In a kind of a typical year, you get about 1 million rental evictions. So we'll probably get, 800K over the next 6 months. So it'll be a bit elevated. We're going to see it, and it's going to be in certain parts of the country, not everywhere. It's not a problem, from coast to coast. It's a problem in big urban centers.
Next, we're crossing the Atlantic to Dublin, where tenants are protecting themselves by putting up a united front.
It is a lot harder for a landlord to ignore calls from 1,300 members across Ireland. We will make your life difficult, for want of a better phrase.
Like other cities we've already looked at, Dublin's housing market is red hot, but for a unique set of reasons.
In Dublin, a big problem we've had is lots of developments going up that are exclusively built to rent at a very high profit margin, looking to cram as much spaces into a single building as they can, and then charging premium.
Ireland's low corporation tax in comparison with its EU neighbours has also attracted global tech firms to set up shop there, bringing skilled workers with the means to pay higher rents. Despite attempts to control them, for over a decade now, rents across Ireland have been rising and rising. But those rises have been far outstripped by rents in the capital. A place in Dublin's city centre will now cost you well over double what it would have in 2010. As a result, tenants' organisations like Car2 have formed to give individual tenants the power of the collective. They work like a trade union, but for renters. And they've shown they're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their members, even blocking evictions while they're happening.
A gentleman had his door drilled in the early hours of the morning, and a group of heavies threw his entire life out on the street. A rather intense standoff with the heavies that led to us essentially shoving them back out of his house and eventually forcing the landlord to come down and negotiate with him, and he got to stay in that house until he now is in more secure housing. But the eviction was not pushed through.
The solution to Dublin's problems, activists say, is simple: build more homes. And that is what the Irish government is planning. 33,000 of them every year through to 2030. It should make a major difference.
People don't have homes right now. People don't have anywhere to go right now. People are trapped in renting right now. This problem isn't going away. This problem will be worse in 10 years than it is now.
So far, we've talked a lot about housing shortages, but building too many houses can also lead to its own problems, as citizens in our next stop will tell you. In a sense, Tokyo's housing market is a story of success. Despite being a major city, it's remained all but immune to the high house prices and rising rents that we've seen in other cities. Why? Because there are plenty of places to live. Japan has consistently built the best part of 1 million new places to live each year for the past decade, the vast majority of them in cities like Tokyo. Supply is far outstripping demand in a country where the population is actually shrinking. In other words, Japan has too many homes. And the phenomenon of young Japanese moving out of the countryside to seek the excitement of the city is resulting in a real problem. Outside of its cities, Japan is becoming riddled with abandoned houses, many of them left to rot by owners for whom the costs and admin associated with keeping them outweigh any benefits from maintaining them. Some researchers say abandoned homes could account for as much as 30% of the country's housing stock by 2038. That's a superabundance of empty houses that many countries could only dream of. And so ends our tour around the world's troubled housing markets. You see, a roof over your head really isn't something you can take for granted. And a global housing market built on shaky foundations is one we need to keep an eye on. And that's all from this edition of Business Beyond. Thanks a lot for watching. If you want to know more about the money that makes the world go round, be sure to check out the Business Beyond playlist. Oh, and while you're here, why not hit like and subscribe? Until next time, take care.